Three bounty hunters circle the ranch at dawn, rifles drawn, hunting for the man Colt loves. Inside the cabin, Jesse grips a revolver with shaking hands while Colt makes an impossible choice: lie to save him or lose everything he's built. One wrong word, and they both hang. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you're watching from and don't forget to click subscribe. The dust hung thick in the stable air, golden motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. Colt Brennan stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching long across the hay-strewn floor, watching the new handwork. The kid couldn't have been more than 22, all lean muscle and nervous energy, pitchforking hay like his life depended on it, like he had something to prove. Colt knew that feeling. He'd carried it once too, back when the world was wider and his heart wasn't yet scarred by betrayal and loss. Now, at 38, he owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, commanded 30 men, and kept everyone at arm's length. It was easier that way. Safer. The kid straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and their eyes met. Something flickered in that gaze, something that made Colt's chest tighten in a way he didn't want to name. The boy looked away first, color rising in his cheeks, and Colt felt the familiar war begin inside him. Walk away, you know better. But his boots stayed planted. The kid's name was Jesse Madsen, and he'd arrived 3 weeks ago with nothing but a worn saddle, a letter of reference from a ranch in Colorado, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He worked harder than any 2 men combined, never complained, never asked for more than his wages. And he watched Colt when he thought no one was looking. Colt had caught those glances, felt the weight of them like brands on his skin. He told himself it meant nothing. Ranch hands came and went. This one would be no different. But Jesse was different. He moved through the world with a quiet grace that didn't match his calloused hands, spoke less than most but said more with his silence. And when he smiled, rare as rain in August, it lit something in Colt that he'd thought had died years ago. Now, in the stable's golden light, Colt stepped forward. His voice came out rougher than intended. "You work too hard. Gonna burn yourself out before winter." Jesse turned, pitchfork still in hand, and for a moment neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged, heavy with all the words they weren't saying. "I can handle it, Mr. Brennan." Jesse's voice was steady, but Colt saw the tremor in his fingers as he gripped the wooden handle tighter. "It's Colt." Colt moved closer, each step deliberate. "We're not in town. No need for formalities here." Jesse's throat worked as he swallowed. His eyes darted to Colt's face, then away, like he couldn't quite bear to hold the gaze, but couldn't resist trying. Colt stopped 3 feet away, close enough to see the fine sheen of sweat on Jesse's neck, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, close enough to smell hay and honest work and something underneath that was purely him. "You got a girl back in Colorado?" The question surprised them both. Jesse's eyes widened, then shuddered. "No, sir, no girl." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning that Colt felt all the way to his bones. He should turn around, should walk out of this stable, and keep the carefully constructed walls around his heart intact. Instead, he heard himself say, "Good. That ain't what you want anyway." The silence that followed was deafening. Jesse's knuckles went white on the pitchfork. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Colt watched emotions war across that young face, fear and hope and longing all tangled together, and recognized every single one because he'd felt them himself once, in another lifetime. "How do you know what I want?" Jesse's voice came out barely above a whisper. Colt took another step. Now only a foot separated them, close enough that he could see the flecks of silver in those storm-gray eyes, the way Jesse's pulse hammered in his throat. "Because I see you watching me when you think I'm not paying attention, because you flinch every time I come near. But it ain't fear that makes you pull away. It's something else entirely." Jesse's breathing had gone shallow. His eyes searched Colt's face like he was looking for permission, for confirmation that this moment was real and not some fevered dream. I can't," the young man stammered, but his body betrayed him, swaying forward despite his words. "Can't what?" Colt's voice had dropped to something low and dangerous. "Can't admit what you feel. Can't let yourself want something you've been taught is wrong." The pitchfork clattered to the ground. Jesse's hands came up, hovering in the space between them, shaking with the effort of restraint. Every part of Colt's being screamed at him to close that distance, to reach out and pull this beautiful broken thing into his arms. But he held himself still, knowing that Jesse needed to be the one to make the choice, needed to step across that line of his own free will. "I've spent 6 years running from this," Jesse said, his voice breaking. 6 years, trying to be something I'm not, trying to kill the part of me that looks at men like you and feels. Colt waited, every muscle tense. Feels what? Jesse's eyes met his, naked and desperate, like I'm drowning in your air. The words hit Colt like a physical blow. He'd spent a decade building his armor, convincing himself that loneliness was preferable to the risk of being seen, truly seen, by another soul. But standing here in the fading light with this young man's confession hanging between them, he felt every wall crack, then drown, Colt said softly. Jesse closed the distance, not with his hands, not yet, but with his eyes, his body, the sheer force of his longing. They stood so close now that Colt could feel the heat radiating from Jesse's skin, could count each ragged breath. "This is dangerous," Jesse whispered. "For both of us." "I know." "Then why?" "Because some things are worth the danger." Colt's hand rose slowly, giving Jesse every chance to pull away. His calloused fingers brushed against Jesse's jaw, feather light, and the young man's eyes fluttered closed. The sound that escaped him was part gasp, part surrender. "I've never," Jesse started, but Colt shook his head. "I know. We'll go slow." The words were a promise and a threat all at once. Slow meant they were acknowledging this thing between them, giving it room to grow. Slow meant there would be a next time, and a time after that. Slow meant neither of them was walking away. Jesse leaned into the touch, his face turning until Colt's palm cradled his cheek. When he opened his eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I don't know how to do this." Colt's thumb traced the line of Jesse's cheekbone, marveling at the softness of skin that worked leather and steel all day. "Neither do I. Not anymore. But we'll figure it out." Outside, the dinner bell rang, shattering the moment. Jesse jerked back, reality crashing in, and Colt let his hand fall. The loss of contact felt like a wound. They stared at each other across the sudden distance, chests heaving like they'd been running. "We should," Jesse gestured vaguely toward the door. "Yeah?" Colt's voice was rough. But Jesse didn't move. Neither did Colt. The space between them felt alive, electric with possibility and terror. "Tonight," Jesse said suddenly, "after everyone's asleep, meet me by the creek." It wasn't a question, but Colt answered anyway. "I'll be there." Jesse nodded once, then turned and fled the stable like the devil himself was on his heels. Colt stood alone in the gathering shadows, his hand still tingling from the brief contact, his heart pounding a rhythm that felt both familiar and terrifyingly new. He'd told himself for years that he was done with this, that the pain of his past had taught him to keep his distance. But Jesse Madsen had walked onto his ranch 3 weeks ago and shattered every resolution without even trying. Colt pressed his palm against his chest, feeling his heart race beneath the worn cotton of his shirt. This was foolish, reckless, in a territory where men had been hanged for less, where even the whisper of such things could destroy everything he'd built. But as the sun sank lower and the shadows lengthened, Colt knew he'd be at that creek tonight. Knew he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to look at him the way Jesse did, with a hunger that matched his own. Some things were worth the danger. Some things were worth burning the whole world down for. He just hoped they both survived the fire. The ranch house felt too small that evening. Colt sat at the head of the long table, 30 men around him eating and talking, and all he could focus on was the empty chair where Jesse should have been. The kid had taken his meal outside, claiming he wanted to check on a mare about to foal. No one questioned it. No one noticed the way Colt's eyes kept drifting to the window, searching the darkness beyond. The meal dragged on forever. His foreman, Dutch, kept trying to discuss the fall roundup, and Colt forced himself to pay attention, to nod, and make the appropriate responses. But inside, he was counting minutes, watching the old clock on the mantel tick toward midnight. Finally, mercifully, the men began to drift off to the bunkhouse. Colt remained at the table, nursing a whiskey he didn't taste, until the house fell silent around him. He sat there in the darkness, giving himself one last chance to change his mind. This was madness. Jesse was young, vulnerable, working under his authority. Every rule Colt had ever made for himself was about to be broken. But the memory of Jesse's voice, the raw honesty of "like I'm drowning in your air," pulled him to his feet. He moved through the house like a ghost, out the back door, across the yard, where shadows pooled thick beneath the cottonwoods. The creek lay beyond the eastern pasture, a silver thread in the moonlight. As Colt approached, he saw a figure sitting on the bank, knees drawn up, staring at the water. His heart did something complicated in his chest. Jesse didn't turn around, but his voice carried across the grass. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Colt sat beside him, leaving a careful distance between them. Almost didn't. Jesse turned then, and in the moonlight his face looked younger, more fragile. "But you did." "Yeah." They sat in silence, listening to the water move over stones, the distant call of a night bird. Colt felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on him, all the warnings he should give, the reasons this couldn't work. Instead, he said, "Tell me about Colorado." Jesse's laugh was bitter. "Not much to tell. Worked a ranch outside Denver. Good people, but..." He trailed off, picking at the grass. "But you couldn't be yourself." "No." Jesse's voice went quiet. "There was a man there, the owner's son. He was like me, or I thought he was. We were careful, but someone saw us. Just talking, nothing more. But that was enough. His father sent me away in the middle of the night with half my wages and a warning never to come back. Said if I did, he'd see me hanged." Colt's jaw clenched. "I'm sorry." Jesse shrugged, but the gesture was too casual to be real. "It's how the world works. Men like us, we don't get happy endings. We get run out of town or worse. So why are you here? Why risk it again?" Jesse finally looked at him, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes stole Colt's breath. "Because the alternative is worse. Because I'd rather have one honest moment than a lifetime of pretending. Because when you looked at me in that stable today, I felt more alive than I have in 6 years." Colt's hand moved of its own accord, covering Jesse's where it rested on the grass between them. The touch was electric, sending shivers up his arm. Jesse's fingers turned, intertwining with his, and they sat there, holding hands in the moonlight like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I had someone once," Colt heard himself say, "long time ago, before I bought this place. His name was Marcus. We worked together on a cattle drive up from Texas." The words came easier than he expected, a confession he'd never made to another living soul. "We had 6 months together, 6 months of stolen moments and careful glances. Then one night, someone found us. There was a fight, accusations. Marcus ran. I never saw him again." Jesse's grip tightened. "Is that why you never... why I keep everyone at a distance?" Colt nodded. "Yeah, seemed safer that way. Lonelier, but safer. But then you showed up." Jesse shifted closer until their shoulders touched. "I'm not running, Mr. Brennan." "Colt." Jesse's voice was soft. "I'm not running, Colt. I'm tired of running." "Then what are you doing?" "Staying, fighting, choosing something real for once in my life, even if it terrifies me." Colt turned to look at him properly, drinking in every detail of that earnest young face. "You know what you're risking?" "Everything. Same as you." They sat there, hands clasped, shoulders touching, and Colt felt the careful control he'd maintained for 10 years begin to slip. Jesse was warm and solid beside him, smelling of honest sweat and hay and promise. The night wrapped around them like a cocoon, holding them separate from the harsh judgments of the daylight world. "Can I?" Jesse started, then stopped, gathering courage. "Can I kiss you?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with significance. This would change everything, would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Colt should say no, should send Jesse back to the bunkhouse, should maintain the careful distance that kept them both safe. Instead, he cupped Jesse's face in both hands and said, "Yes." Jesse moved slowly, giving Colt every chance to change his mind. Their faces drew closer in the moonlight, breath mingling, and Colt felt his eyes flutter closed. When their lips finally met, it was gentle, tentative, a question more than a demand. Jesse's mouth was soft against his, trembling slightly, and Colt felt something in his chest crack wide open. He'd forgotten this, the simple sweetness of connection, of being seen and chosen despite all the reasons to walk away. Jesse's hand came up to rest against Colt's chest, fingers splaying over his heart, and Colt deepened the contact, pouring 10 years of loneliness into that moment. Jesse made a sound, something between a gasp and a sigh, and pressed closer. His other hand tangled in Colt's hair, and for a while they were just two people who'd found each other in the darkness, who'd chosen connection over safety. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Colt rested his forehead against Jesse's. The young man's eyes were closed, his face peaceful in a way Colt had never seen before. "That was my first," Jesse whispered. First kiss with someone I actually wanted. First time I didn't feel like I was pretending or hiding or doing something shameful. First time it felt right." Colt's heart clenched. He pulled Jesse closer, wrapping his arms around him, and felt the young man melt into the embrace. They stayed like that, holding each other beside the creek while the stars wheeled overhead and the night stretched on. "This changes things," Colt said eventually. Jesse nodded against his shoulder. "I know. We'll have to be careful. More careful than careful." "I know that too. But," Jesse pulled back enough to meet his eyes, "but I'm not walking away from this. From you, neither am I." The words felt like a vow. They sat there until the eastern sky began to lighten, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. Jesse told stories about growing up in Kansas, about the day he'd realized he was different and the years he'd spent trying to change it. Colt shared memories of Marcus, of the life he'd imagined they might have had, of the walls he'd built to survive the loss. As dawn approached, they reluctantly separated, knowing the ranch would wake soon and eyes would be watching. But before Jesse left, Colt caught his hand one last time. "Tomorrow night?" Jesse's smile was like sunrise. "Tomorrow night." They walked back separately, Jesse cutting through the pasture while Colt took the long way around. But even apart, Colt felt the invisible thread connecting them, pulling taut across the distance. He'd spent a decade convincing himself that loneliness was a price worth paying for safety. Now, watching Jesse disappear into the gray dawn, he understood what he'd actually been doing. He'd been waiting for someone brave enough to see him fully, to want him anyway, to choose the risk because the alternative was worse than dying. Jesse Madsen had walked onto his ranch 3 weeks ago and changed everything. And Colt Brennan, hardened rancher and solitary man, found himself willing to burn down the world for one more stolen moment in the moonlight. The work of the ranch went on as always, but everything had shifted. Colt caught himself watching Jesse throughout the day, his eyes following the lean figure as he worked with the horses, mended fence line, carried hay bales that should have required 2 men. And Jesse, when he thought no one was looking, would glance toward the main house with an expression that made Colt's chest ache. They were careful, painfully, meticulously careful. No lingering touches in daylight, no private conversations where others might see. But at night, after the bunkhouse fell silent, they met by the creek. Sometimes they talked for hours, sharing histories and dreams and fears. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, shoulders touching, hands clasped, grateful for the connection. And sometimes, when the moon was dark and the risk felt worth it, they came together in ways that rewrote everything Colt thought he knew about connection. 3 weeks into their hidden courtship, Dutch, cornered Colt in the barn. The foreman was a good man, loyal and sharp-eyed, and he'd been watching. "The kid's good with horses," Dutch said casually, checking the fit of a saddle. "Real natural touch, better than anyone I've seen in years." Colt kept his voice level. "That's why I keep him on." Dutch was quiet for a moment. "That the only reason?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Colt turned slowly, meeting his foreman's eyes, trying to read the intent behind the words. "What are you asking, Dutch?" The older man held his gaze steadily. "I'm asking if you know what you're doing, if you've thought about what happens if the wrong person figures out why that boy looks at you like you hung the moon." Colt's hands clenched into fists. "Careful, Dutch. I've been working for you 8 years, boss. I ain't saying this to cause trouble. I'm saying it because I've seen what happens to men like you and him. Seen them dragged through streets, seen them swing from trees. Just want you to have your eyes open." Colt's throat was tight. "My eyes are open. Then you know this can't last. Eventually someone will see, someone will talk, and when that happens, there won't be anything I can do to protect either of you." "I know." Dutch sighed, shaking his head. "Lord help me, but that boy makes you smile again. First time in 10 years, I've seen you look like a living man instead of a ghost. So I'll keep my mouth shut and my eyes open. But you both need to be smarter." Colt nodded, gratitude and fear warring in his chest. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Just promise me you'll think about the cost, about what you're both willing to lose." That night, Colt told Jesse about the conversation. They sat by the creek, closer than usual, Jesse's head resting on Colt's shoulder. "Dutch knows," Jesse said quietly. "Not a question. He suspects. He won't say anything, but he's right. We're taking too many chances." Jesse was quiet for a long moment. Then he straightened, turning to face Colt directly. "So what do we do? Walk away now while we still can?" The thought of it made Colt's chest constrict painfully. "Is that what you want?" "No," Jesse's voice was fierce. "God, no. What I want is impossible. I want to hold your hand in daylight, want to eat dinner beside you without pretending you're just my boss, want to wake up next to you and not have to sneak away before dawn. I want things men like us don't get to have." Colt pulled him close, pressing his face into Jesse's hair. "I want those things too. Then we keep being careful. We keep stealing moments when we can, because having this, even in secret, is better than not having it at all." They held each other as the stars wheeled overhead, and Colt felt the weight of Dutch's warning settling into his bones. This couldn't last forever. Eventually their luck would run out, their careful charade would crumble, and they'd have to make impossible choices. But tonight, with Jesse warm and solid in his arms, Colt chose not to think about endings. He chose to be present in this moment, to memorize the sound of Jesse's breathing, the weight of him, the simple miracle of being wanted and choosing to want in return. "Some things are worth the danger," he whispered into the darkness. Jesse's arms tightened around him. "Some things are worth everything." And in that moment, surrounded by night and possibility, two men who'd been taught their whole lives that what they felt was wrong chose each other anyway. They chose hope over fear, connection over loneliness, and the terrifying freedom of being truly seen. The West was harsh and unforgiving, but under the endless stars, Colt Brennan and Jesse Madsen carved out a space that was theirs alone. A secret world where they could be honest, vulnerable, and whole. Where they could breathe freely, if only for stolen hours in the darkness. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed took on a strange double quality, like living two lives at once. In daylight, Colt was the boss, Jesse the hired hand, and they maintained the careful distance expected of their positions. But underneath every ordinary interaction hummed an electric current that neither could ignore. A simple instruction about mending fence became weighted with unspoken meaning. A glance across the yard carried the memory of moonlit confessions. Even silence between them felt full, pregnant with everything they couldn't say in front of others. Colt found himself inventing reasons to check on Jesse's work, riding out to the far pastures where the young man labored alone. Each time, Jesse would straighten from whatever task occupied him, dust on his clothes and hope in his eyes, and they'd stand there awkwardly, trying to remember how to speak. Like employer and employee, when all Colt wanted was to close the distance between them. "You're doing good work," Colt would say, the words feeling inadequate. "Thank you, sir." Jesse's response would be proper, respectful, but his eyes would hold a question. "Tonight?" And Colt would nod, barely perceptible, before riding away with his heart hammering against his ribs. The other ranch hands noticed nothing, or if they did, they said nothing. Men in the West learned early that some things were better left unspoken, that survival often depended on minding your own business. Only Dutch watched with knowing eyes, his weathered face betraying nothing but concern that weighed heavier than judgment. One afternoon, as Colt worked in the barn organizing tack, Jesse appeared in the doorway. The young man hesitated on the threshold, backlit by the harsh sun, and for a moment Colt's breath caught at the sight of him. There was something about the way light played across Jesse's features that made him look both impossibly young and ancient with sorrow. "Boss," Jesse said, the word careful and formal. "Got a question about the bay mare. She's favoring her left foreleg." Colt set down the bridle he'd been cleaning. "Show me." They walked together toward the corral, maintaining a careful distance of 3 feet between them. To anyone watching, they were simply rancher and hand discussing livestock. But Colt felt Jesse's presence beside him like heat from a fire, warming him even without touch. At the corral fence, they leaned against the worn wood, both looking at the horses but acutely aware of each other. Jesse's hand rested on the top rail, inches from Colt's own, and the space between their fingers felt charged with possibility. "There," Jesse said softly, pointing as the mare shifted her weight. "See how she's not putting full pressure on it?" Colt watched the horse, but his attention kept sliding to Jesse's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his throat moved when he swallowed. "Yeah, I see it. Probably just a stone bruise. Give her a few days rest?" Jesse nodded, but neither of them moved. They stood there in the afternoon heat, close but not touching, surrounded by the normal sounds of the ranch, the snort of horses, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of windmill blades turning, and underneath it all, the thunderous sound of Colt's own heartbeat. "I miss you," Jesse whispered, so quietly Colt almost missed it. "Even though you're right here, I miss you." The words hit Colt like a fist to the chest. He gripped the fence rail harder, knuckles going white with the effort of not reaching for Jesse right there in broad daylight. "I know, I feel it too. This walking on knives, pretending. How long can we do this?" Jesse's voice carried a tremor of desperation. "How long until someone sees? Until we make a mistake?" Colt had no answer. He'd been asking himself the same question every night, lying awake in his too-large bed, aching for the man sleeping in the bunkhouse with 24 others. As long as we have to. As long as we can. Jesse turned his head then, looking at Colt directly despite the risk. His storm-gray eyes were filled with something that looked like mourning. "Sometimes I think it would have been easier if I'd never stopped here. If I'd kept riding and never knew what this felt like." "Don't say that." Colt's voice came out harsher than intended. "Don't you dare say that." "Why not?" "It's true. At least before, I only had to live with wanting something I couldn't name. Now I know exactly what I'm missing every second we're apart." Colt's hand moved before he could stop it, reaching across the small distance to cover Jesse's on the rail. The touch lasted only a heartbeat before he pulled away, but it was enough. Enough to say what words couldn't, that he felt the same ache, the same desperate longing. From across the yard, someone called Colt's name. They both straightened, the moment shattering like glass. Colt turned to see one of the hands waving him over, something about a supply order that needed approval. "Tonight," Colt said under his breath. "Usual place." Jesse nodded, already stepping back, rebuilding the careful walls between them. "Yes, sir. I'll see to the mare." As Colt walked away, he felt Jesse's gaze following him like a physical touch. Every step felt like moving through deep water, fighting against the current that wanted to pull him back. This was madness, this constant push and pull, the exhausting effort of hiding what burned so bright between them. But that night, When the ranch finally settled into sleep and Colt made his way to the creek, he found Jesse already waiting. The young man stood at the water's edge, his silhouette dark against the silver ripple of moonlight on water, and the sight of him made everything worth it. Every careful word, every stolen glance, every moment of aching restraint, all of it disappeared when Jesse turned and saw him approaching. Colt didn't speak. He simply opened his arms, and Jesse came into them like coming home. They stood there holding each other, Jesse's face pressed against Colt's shoulder, Colt's hand cradling the back of Jesse's head, and for those precious moments, the world narrowed to just this, just them, just the simple truth of two people who'd found each other against impossible odds. "I thought about leaving today," Jesse confessed into the darkness. "Thought about saddling up and riding out before this gets any harder." Colt's arms tightened involuntarily. "But you didn't." "No." Jesse pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "Because leaving you would be harder than anything else. Because even stolen moments are better than nothing." They stood there in the moonlight, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. Around them the night sounds continued, crickets singing, water flowing over stones, the distant howl of a coyote. The world kept turning, indifferent to their struggle, offering neither blessing nor condemnation. "Tell me about Marcus," Jesse said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to him after he ran?" Colt was quiet for a long moment, the old pain stirring in his chest. "I don't know. I looked for him, spent 6 months tracking every rumor, every whisper. But he vanished like smoke. Sometimes I wonder if he made it somewhere safe, somewhere he could start over. Other times, I fear the worst. Do you still love him?" The question hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Colt considered it carefully, examining the scar tissue around his heart. "I loved who we were together, but that was 10 years ago, and I'm not the same man anymore. Neither would he be, if he's still alive." Jesse was quiet, processing this. Then softly, "Are you afraid I'll run too? When things get too dangerous?" Colt pulled him closer, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm terrified of it, but I'm more terrified of never taking the chance, of letting fear make me push you away before someone else does." They stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms under the vast expanse of stars, until the eastern sky began to pale. As always, they separated reluctantly, Jesse heading back toward the bunkhouse while Colt took the long route around the property. But this time, as Colt watched Jesse disappear into the pre-dawn shadows, a new determination settled in his chest. This couldn't continue indefinitely. Something would have to give, some choice would have to be made. But tonight, wrapped in Jesse's warmth and trust, Colt had felt more alive than he had in a decade, and that feeling was worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. The question was how long their luck would hold, and what price they'd ultimately pay for choosing each other in a world that would never understand. The turning point came on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, when the air turned crisp and the cottonwood leaves began their slow transformation to gold. Colt was in the ranch office going over accounts when Dutch appeared in the doorway, his face grave. "We got trouble, boss." Colt looked up from the ledger, reading the tension in his foreman's shoulders. "What kind?" "The kind that rides in asking questions. 3 men just came through town, strangers. They've been showing around a drawing, asking if anyone's seen a young man matching the description." Colt's blood went cold. "Description of who?" Dutch pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket and laid it on the desk. Colt's hand shook as he unfolded it. The sketch was crude but recognizable. A young man with distinctive storm-gray eyes and a scar along his left jawline, a scar Colt had traced with his fingers in the moonlight. "Jesse," Colt breathed, "says here he's wanted for theft and assault back in Colorado." Dutch's voice was carefully neutral. "Says there's a reward of $500 for information leading to his capture." Colt's mind raced. Jesse had told him about being run off the ranch in Colorado, but he'd never mentioned assault. Then again, defending yourself against men who wanted you dead might look like assault to the wrong eyes. Where are these men now? Still in town, far as I know. But boss, Dutch leaned forward, lowering his voice. If they come out here asking questions, and they find him, and anyone realizes you've been hiding him, harboring a fugitive, that's serious trouble. Could lose the ranch. Could lose everything. Colt stood abruptly, chair scraping against the wooden floor. Where's Jesse now? North pasture, mending fence. Colt grabbed his hat and coat. Keep those men away from here as long as you can. Tell them we haven't seen anyone matching that description. I need time to think. Dutch caught his arm as he passed. Boss, maybe it's time to let him go, before this gets worse. Colt met his foreman's eyes, seeing the genuine concern there alongside the warning. Can't do that, Dutch. Can't send him back to hang for defending himself, even if it costs you everything. Colt pulled free, his jaw set. Especially then, he rode hard to the north pasture, fear driving him faster than caution. When he crested the ridge and saw Jesse below, working the fence line with steady competence, everything in him wanted to freeze this moment, to hold on to the simple peace of watching the man he'd come to care for go about honest work under an open sky. But peace was a luxury they no longer had. Jesse looked up as Colt approached, and immediately his expression changed. He dropped the tools and walked forward quickly. What's wrong? Colt dismounted, glancing around to make sure they were truly alone. There are men in town. Bounty hunters, looks like. They're showing around a drawing of you. Jesse's face went white. The color drained so fast Colt thought he might collapse. He reached out instinctively to steady him, and Jesse gripped his arms like they were the only solid thing in a tilting world. It's him, Jesse whispered. The ranch owner's son from Colorado. He must have reported me as a thief, claimed I attacked him. Did you? Jesse's eyes flashed with something fierce. He came at me in the barn one night, drunk and angry because I'd rejected him earlier. Said if he couldn't have me willing, he'd take what he wanted anyway. I fought back, broke his nose and 2 ribs. When his father found us, he only saw his son bleeding and me standing over him. The truth didn't matter. Colt felt rage surge through him, hot and protective. So they want you for defending yourself. The law doesn't see it that way. To them, I'm just a thief and a deviant. If they take me back, Jesse's voice cracked. I'll hang Colt. They'll hang me and call it justice. That's not going to happen. Colt's voice was steel. I won't let it. You can't stop them. Jesse pulled away, running shaking hands through his hair. If they find me here, you'll be implicated. Harboring a fugitive, they'll take your ranch. Maybe arrest you too. I have to leave. Now. Tonight. No. The word came out harder than Colt intended. He softened his voice but kept the determination. We'll figure this out together. There's nothing to figure out. Jesse's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Don't you see? This is exactly what I was afraid of. That caring about me would destroy you. I should have kept riding. Should never have stayed. But you did stay. Colt stepped closer, cupping Jesse's face in both hands, not caring if anyone saw. You stayed, and I'm glad you did. These past weeks, they've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Don't take that away now. Colt, Jesse's voice broke. You'll lose everything. I've already lost everything that mattered once. I'm not doing it again by choice. They stood there, faces inches apart, both breathing hard. Around them, the prairie grass swayed in the wind, indifferent to their crisis. In the distance, a hawk circled lazy patterns against the autumn sky. Finally, Jesse spoke, his voice steadier now. Then what do we do? Colt's mind had been working through possibilities even as they talked. We send you north. There's a ranch across the Wyoming border. Owner's an old friend from my army days. He owes me a favor and he doesn't ask questions. You go tonight before those bounty hunters start spreading out to search the ranches. And you? I stay here and make sure they don't follow you. Give you enough head start that by the time they realize you were here, you're long gone. Jesse shook his head. You'd lie for me? Risk everything? I'd burn this whole ranch to the ground if it kept you safe, Colt said simply, and meant it. The truth of it hung between them, bigger than fear, stronger than the forces trying to tear them apart. Jesse's eyes searched Colt's face, looking for hesitation, finding none. "I don't deserve you," Jesse whispered. "You deserve someone who sees you for who you really are. Someone who knows your worth isn't defined by the people who tried to destroy you." They came together then, holding each other tight there, in the open pasture under the wide sky. Two men choosing each other despite everything screaming at them to let go. Colt breathed in the scent of Jesse's hair, memorized the feeling of him solid and warm in his arms, tried to store up enough of this moment to last through whatever separation lay ahead. "When do I leave?" Jesse asked finally. "Tonight. Soon as the ranch settles down. Dutch will help. He can create a distraction if needed. Will I see you again?" Colt pulled back enough to look him in the eye. "Yes. I don't know how or when, but yes. This isn't goodbye forever, Jesse. It's just goodbye for now." Jesse nodded, but Colt could see the fear in his eyes. The knowledge that promises made in crisis often broke against the harsh reality of the world. "How will I know when it's safe? I'll send word through my friend. When things calm down, when those bounty hunters move on, I'll come find you. And if they don't move on, if they keep looking, then I'll come anyway." Colt's voice was firm. "I spent 10 years alone after Marcus, convinced that was safer than risking my heart again. I'm not wasting another decade. We'll find a way, Jesse, even if we have to leave everything behind and start over somewhere no one knows us." The sun was sinking lower now, painting the prairie in shades of amber and gold. They had hours yet before darkness, hours they should have spent preparing, planning, making sure every detail was accounted for. Instead, they stayed there together, hands clasped, foreheads touching, stealing one last moment of peace before the storm. "I love you," Jesse said suddenly. "I know we've never said it, but I need you to know. Whatever happens, wherever we end up, I love you." Colt's heart clenched. He'd known it, felt it in every touch and glance they'd shared, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it real in a way that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. "I love you too," Colt replied, his voice rough with emotion. "That's why I'm fighting for this, for us." They rode back to the ranch separately as always, maintaining the careful fiction even as it crumbled around them. But now every gesture carried added weight. Every glance felt like a goodbye. That evening, as the ranch hands gathered for dinner, Colt watched Jesse from across the room. The young man sat at the far end of the table, eating mechanically, his eyes distant. No one seemed to notice anything amiss. To them, Jesse was just another hired hand, quiet and hard-working, but ultimately forgettable. Only Dutch caught Colt's eye, giving a subtle nod. Everything was arranged, a horse saddled and waiting in the far barn, supplies packed in saddlebags, a map marked with the safest route north. When the time came, Jesse would slip away like smoke, leaving no trace except in Colt's memory. After dinner, as men drifted off to their evening routines, Colt stood on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. His chest felt tight, his hands restless. Somewhere out there, Jesse was preparing to leave, packing the few possessions he owned, saying goodbye to a life they'd barely begun to build together. Footsteps sounded behind him. Dutch joined him at the railing, lighting his pipe in the gathering darkness. "You're sure about this, boss?" "No," Colt admitted. "But I'm doing it anyway. That boy's lucky to have someone willing to sacrifice so much." Colt shook his head. "I'm the lucky one. He gave me a reason to feel alive again." They stood in companionable silence for a while, two men who'd worked together long enough to understand each other without words. Finally, Dutch spoke again. "There's something you should know. Those bounty hunters, they'll be back. And they're not the only ones looking. Word is the ranch owner in Colorado has put up his own money, additional reward. He wants the boy found and made an example of." Colt's jaw tightened. "All the more reason to get Jesse somewhere safe. Just be careful, boss. Men with that kind of money and determination, they don't give up easy. And if they ever figure out what Jesse really means to you," Dutch's voice dropped lower, "they'll use it against you both. I know." Colt's hands gripped the railing hard enough to hurt. "But what's the alternative? Let fear make all my choices? Send away the only person who's made me feel human in a decade?" "No alternative," Dutch agreed quietly. "Just wanted you to know what you're up against." As full darkness fell, Colt moved through the ranch house, making his usual evening rounds, checking locks and banking fires. But his mind was elsewhere, counting down the minutes until midnight, when Jesse would slip away into the night. The house felt emptier than usual, echoing with the absence of something that had never technically been there. He poured himself a whiskey, but didn't drink it, just held the glass and watched the amber liquid catch the lamplight. A soft knock at the back door made him turn. Jesse stood there, a dark silhouette against the starlit night, and Colt's breath caught. They'd agreed no final goodbyes, that it would be easier for Jesse to simply vanish. But here he stood, and Colt was grateful for his break-in of their plan. "Couldn't leave without seeing you one more time," Jesse said softly, stepping inside. Colt set down the glass and crossed the room, pulling Jesse into his arms. They held each other in the shadowed kitchen, both memorizing the feel of this moment. "It's almost time," Jesse whispered. "Dutch is creating that distraction in 10 minutes. Colt nodded against Jesse's hair, unable to speak around the tightness in his throat. Everything he wanted to say felt inadequate, too small to contain the enormity of what he felt. "When I get to Wyoming," Jesse continued, "what name should I use? Can't risk someone connecting me to you." "Use your real name," Colt said. "I don't want you hiding who you are anymore. My friend will protect you." Jesse pulled back, his storm gray eyes searching Colt's face in the dim light. "You're a good man, Colt Brennan. Better than this world deserves." "Come back to me," Colt said, instead of all the other things crowding his throat. "Whatever it takes, however long, come back to me." Jesse nodded, then leaned in and kissed him. It was different from their other kisses. This one, desperate and tender and tasting of goodbye. When they broke apart, both had tears tracking down their faces. "I have to go," Jesse said, but his hands still gripped Colt's shirt like he couldn't quite make himself let go. "I know." They stood there for one more heartbeat, two more, three. Then Jesse stepped back, releasing his hold. He moved to the door, paused with his hand on the frame, looked back one last time. "I love you," he said again. "I love you too. Be safe." Then Jesse was gone, slipping into the night like a shadow. Colt stood frozen in the empty kitchen, listening to the distant sound of hoofbeats fading north. His chest felt hollowed out, carved empty by loss, even as his mind insisted this was temporary, that they'd find their way back to each other. He moved to the window, watching the darkness where Jesse had disappeared, and made himself a promise. He would fix this. Would find a way to clear Jesse's name, to make it safe for him to exist in the world without fear. Whatever it took, however long, Colt would move mountains to bring Jesse home. Outside, he heard Dutch's voice raised in false alarm about a broken fence, drawing the attention of anyone who might have noticed unusual activity. The distraction had worked. Jesse was away clean. Colt touched his fingers to the window glass, cold against his skin, and whispered into the empty room. "Wait for me." The next 3 days were the longest of Colt's life. The bounty hunters did return to the ranch, just as Dutch had predicted. 3 hard-faced men with guns and suspicious eyes, asking questions about recent hires and strangers passing through. Colt met them at the gate, his expression carefully neutral. "We don't have time for drifters here. Any man who works this ranch has been with me at least 6 months. The lead bounty hunter, a scarred man named Pike, pulled out the drawing. "You're sure you haven't seen this man? Young, early 20s, gray eyes, scar on his jaw." Colt studied the paper as if considering carefully, letting his eyes trace the crude lines that couldn't capture Jesse's actual presence. "Can't say I have, but I don't always see every man who passes through. Talk to my foreman. He knows more about the hands than I do." Dutch backed up Colt's story perfectly, showing them the ranch's employment records, all legitimate, none matching Jesse's description. The bounty hunters searched the bunkhouse and barn anyway, but found nothing. Jesse's few possessions had been carefully removed, his bunk stripped and reassigned. It was as if he'd never existed. Still, Pike wasn't satisfied. He lingered in town for days, asking questions, following up on rumors. Colt felt the pressure of it like a weight on his chest, wondering if they'd somehow left some trace, some evidence that would lead the hunters north toward where Jesse had fled. A week passed, then 2. The bounty hunters finally moved on, but Colt knew they hadn't given up. They'd simply widened their search, and somewhere out there, they were still looking for Jesse. Colt threw himself into ranch work, driving himself and his men harder than necessary. Anything to keep his mind occupied, to stop the constant worry about whether Jesse had made it safely to Wyoming, whether he was all right, whether he thought about Colt as obsessively as Colt thought about him. At night, lying alone in his bed, Colt would stare at the ceiling and replay every moment they'd shared. Jesse's laugh, rare and precious. The way his eyes lit up when Colt walked into a room. The feeling of falling asleep with Jesse's warmth pressed against him during those few stolen nights when they'd risked everything for a few hours together. The ache of absence became a constant companion, worse than the loneliness that had defined his life before Jesse arrived. At least before he hadn't known what he was missing. Now every sunrise felt like a punishment, one more day without the person who'd made him whole. 3 weeks after Jesse's departure, a letter arrived. No return address, the handwriting unfamiliar. But inside was a single pressed flower, a prairie rose, and Colt's hands shook as he held it. Jesse had made it to Wyoming. He was safe. The relief that washed over Colt nearly brought him to his knees. He sat down hard in his desk chair, clutching the flower like a lifeline, and for the first time since Jesse left, he allowed himself to hope. But hope came with its own complications. The bounty hunters might have moved on, but the threat remained. As long as that false warrant existed, as long as the ranch owner in Colorado wanted revenge, Jesse couldn't come home. And Colt couldn't go to him, not without potentially leading danger straight to his door. They were trapped in a limbo of their own making, separated by circumstance and the cruel prejudices of the world around them. The question was how long they could maintain this holding pattern before something broke. The answer came 2 months later, in the form of a telegram from Colt's old Army friend in Wyoming. The message was brief, but its implications were enormous. Your friend is safe but restless. Bounty hunters came through asking questions. Didn't find anything, but they're persistent. Suggest permanent solution. Come when you can. Colt read the telegram 3 times, his mind racing. Permanent solution. That could only mean one thing. They needed to clear Jesse's name completely, remove the threat at its source. That meant going back to Colorado, meant confronting the ranch owner and his son, meant finding witnesses or evidence that would prove Jesse's innocence. It was dangerous, potentially futile, and exactly what Colt had to do. He called Dutch into his office that evening and laid out his plan. The foreman listened quietly, his weathered face thoughtful. That's a lot of risk, boss. Going into their territory, asking questions they won't want answered. I know, Colt acknowledged, but I can't let Jesse live the rest of his life as a fugitive. He deserves better. What if you can't prove his innocence? What if the ranch owner's too powerful, got too many people in his pocket? Then I'll find another way. Colt's voice was firm. I'll buy off the right people, call in favors, do whatever it takes. But I'm not accepting that there's no solution. Dutch was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but you're not going alone. I'm coming with you. Colt started to protest, but Dutch held up a hand. You've done right by me for 8 years. Let me return the favor. Besides, you'll need someone watching your back in unfriendly territory. Gratitude welled up in Colt's chest. Thank you, Dutch. They left 3 days later, leaving the ranch in the capable hands of the senior hands. The ride to Colorado took a week, pushing hard through autumn weather that had turned cold and unpredictable. As they crossed the border, Colt felt tension coiling tighter in his gut. This was enemy territory, and every mile deeper they rode increased the risk. The town where Jesse had worked was smaller than Colt expected, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and strangers were noticed immediately. They found a boarding house on the outskirts and paid for a week, telling the owner they were looking to buy horses. For 2 days, Colt and Dutch moved carefully through town, listening to conversations in the saloon, making subtle inquiries about the ranch and its owner. What they learned painted a grim picture. Samuel Garrett owned half the town, sat on the town council, and his son Robert was known for a violent temper and too much drink. But they also learned something interesting. Robert Garrett had a reputation among the working girls at the saloon, and not a good one. He got rough when drunk, had been thrown out more than once for hurting the girls. The madam had complained to the sheriff, but nothing ever came of it, with Samuel Garrett's influence protecting his son. On the third day, Colt found what he was looking for. A young woman named Molly, who worked in the saloon and had known Jesse during his time at the ranch. He was kind, she told Colt quietly when they spoke in the alley behind the saloon. Never looked down on us girls like we were dirt, and he tried to help when Robert would get violent. That's what really set Robert off, I think, that Jesse wouldn't let him bully people. Did you see what happened the night Jesse left? Molly hesitated, fear flickering across her face. I can't get involved. Mr. Garrett would ruin me. Colt pulled out a small leather pouch, heavy with coins. This is enough to get you to California if you want. Start fresh somewhere. Samuel Garrett's name means nothing. All I need is the truth, written down and signed. Molly looked at the money, then at Colt's face. You really care about him, don't you? Jesse, I mean. More than anything, Colt said simply. Something in his tone must have convinced her. She took the money and nodded. All right, I'll tell what I know. But we have to do this fast before anyone sees. An hour later, Colt had a signed statement from Molly describing how she'd heard the fight in the barn, had seen Robert attacking Jesse, and had watched Jesse fight him off in self-defense. She also provided names of 2 other ranch hands who'd witnessed the aftermath and might testify if properly motivated. Over the next week, Colt tracked down those witnesses. One had already left town, but the other, an older cowhand named Tom, agreed to make a statement corroborating Jesse's version of events. With a little financial encouragement, Tom also agreed to testify before a judge if necessary. But getting statements wasn't enough. They needed someone in authority willing to challenge Samuel Garrett's version of events. That proved harder. The local sheriff was in Garrett's pocket, as was the town judge. They finally found their ally in an unexpected place. A circuit judge named Morrison, who was due to pass through the county seat in 2 weeks. A man with a reputation for integrity and a well-known distaste for corruption. Dutch and Colt made the 3-day ride to the county seat and waited for Judge Morrison's arrival. When he finally rode into town, they were ready with their evidence and witnesses. Judge Morrison was a stern-faced man in his 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened to their story, read the statements, and asked pointed questions about the timeline and details. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and studied them both. You understand what you're asking me to do? Challenge a man with significant influence in this territory, potentially ruin his son's reputation, all based on statements from people who have reason to resent the Garretts? We're asking you to see that justice is done, Colt said firmly. That a young man who defended himself doesn't spend the rest of his life running from false charges. And what's your interest in this young man? The judge's eyes were knowing. You've gone to considerable trouble and expense on his behalf. Colt met his gaze steadily. He worked for me. He's a good man who was wronged. That's all the interest I need. The judge studied him a moment longer, then nodded slowly. I'll review the evidence and interview the witnesses myself. If their statements hold up under questioning, I'll issue a dismissal of charges and a ruling that the warrant was improperly obtained. But understand this, Mr. Brennan. If I find you fabricated or coerced testimony, I'll see you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I understand, Your Honor. Everything we've presented is the truth. It took another week, but Judge Morrison was thorough. He interviewed Molly and Tom separately, questioned other townspeople about Robert Garrett's character, and reviewed the original complaint. Finally, he called Colt and Dutch to his temporary chambers. I'm satisfied that Mr. Madsen acted in self-defense and that the charges against him were motivated by revenge rather than justice. Judge Morrison pushed a legal document across the desk. This is an official dismissal of all charges, and a declaration that the warrant is void. I'm also sending a letter to the Marshal Service informing them of this ruling and warning them against any future harassment of Mr. Madsen. Colt's hands shook as he picked up the document. Thank you, Your Honor. You don't know what this means. I think I do. The judge's expression softened slightly. Young man, the world is not always kind to men like you and Mr. Madsen, but the law should be blind to personal prejudice. That's all I'm trying to do here. Ensure the law serves justice, not vengeance. Colt and Dutch rode out of the county seat with the precious document secured in Colt's saddlebag. The journey back to Colt's ranch took 8 days, and every mile felt both too long and too short. Jesse was free, truly free, and could come home. But first, Colt had to get word to him in Wyoming. When they finally reached the ranch, Colt immediately sent a telegram to his friend. "It's done. He can come home." Then came the hardest part, waiting. The journey from Wyoming would take Jesse at least 2 weeks, maybe 3 depending on weather and conditions. Colt threw himself into work during the day and paced the house at night, unable to settle, unable to think about anything except Jesse's imminent return. Dutch watched his restlessness with amusement. "You're going to wear a hole in that floor, boss. Can't help it. It's been 4 months, Dutch. 4 months of not knowing if I'd ever see him again." "Well, you're about to get your wish. Try to look less like a nervous bridegroom when he arrives. The men will talk. Let them talk," Colt said, surprising himself with the words. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of pretending I don't care about the most important person in my life." Dutch raised his eyebrows but said nothing, just clapped Colt on the shoulder and left him to his pacing. On a cold November afternoon, 3 weeks after Colt had sent the telegram, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. Colt was in the barn when one of the hands called out about the approaching horseman. He stepped outside, shielding his eyes against the low sun, and his heart stopped. Even at a distance, he knew that silhouette, the way the rider sat his horse, the particular set of those shoulders. Jesse. Colt didn't run. He walked with deliberate steps to the gate and waited, every nerve in his body screaming to close the distance faster. But he forced himself to move with dignity, aware of the eyes watching from the bunkhouse and barn. As Jesse drew closer, Colt could see his face, thinner than before, weathered by months of worry and exile, but alive with emotion. Those storm-gray eyes locked on Colt's face and didn't waver. Jesse dismounted 10 feet from the gate. For a moment they just stood there, drinking in the sight of each other across the distance. Then Jesse spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Heard you were looking for a ranch hand. Position still open?" Colt felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Depends. You planning on staying this time?" Jesse's mouth curved in a small smile, the first genuine smile Colt had seen from him since the day they'd met. "Yes, sir. If you'll have me. Planning on staying for good. Then the position's yours." Colt's voice was rough. "For as long as you want it." They stood there for another heartbeat, the words they'd really said hanging unspoken between them. Then Jesse led his horse through the gate, and as he passed Colt, their hands brushed just briefly, just enough. That night, after the ranch had settled and the hands were in the bunkhouse, Jesse came to the main house. He knocked softly on the back door, and Colt opened it to find him standing in the moonlight, uncertain despite everything. "Can I come in?" Colt pulled him inside and into his arms. They held each other in the shadowed kitchen, both shaking with relief and joy and the simple miracle of being together again. Jesse's face was pressed against Colt's neck, and Colt felt wetness there, realized Jesse was crying. "I thought I'd never see you again," Jesse whispered. "Thought I'd spend the rest of my life running, always looking over my shoulder." Colt tightened his arms around him. "You're home now. You're safe. And I'm never letting you go again." They stood like that for long minutes, relearning the feel of each other, reassuring themselves this was real. Finally, Jesse pulled back enough to look at Colt's face. "What you did, going to Colorado, getting those statements, facing down the Garretts," Jesse shook his head in wonder. "You could have been killed, could have lost everything. Worth it," Colt said simply. "You're worth everything." Jesse's eyes searched his face. "What happens now? We can't keep hiding forever, Colt. People will figure it out eventually." Colt had been thinking about this for weeks, turning over possibilities and probabilities. "I know. And I'm tired of hiding. Tired of pretending you're just another ranch hand when you're so much more. What are you saying?" Colt took a deep breath, knowing this next step would change everything. "I'm saying we should leave. Not run, but choose to leave. There are places out west, new territories where no one knows us, where we could build something together. openly. Jesse's eyes widened. "You'd give up this ranch? Everything you've built here?" "This ranch was just a place to hide from grief," Colt said. "You gave me something better, a reason to live instead of just exist. So yes, I'd give it up. I'd give up everything for a chance at a real life with you." Jesse was quiet, processing this. Then softly, "When would we leave?" "After winter. Give Dutch time to find a buyer if he wants the ranch, or I'll deed it to him outright. We'll head west come spring, find a piece of land where we can start fresh." "Together," Jesse said, testing the word. "Together," Colt confirmed. "No more hiding, no more pretending. Just us, building the life we want." Jesse leaned in and kissed him, slow and deep and full of promise. When they broke apart, both were smiling. "I love you, Colt Brennan. I love you too, Jesse Madsen." They spent that night talking, making plans, dreaming about the future they'd build together. As dawn approached, Jesse reluctantly prepared to return to the bunkhouse to maintain appearances for a little while longer. But at the door, Colt caught his hand. "This spring, Jesse, we'll start over, and this time, we'll do it right." Jesse squeezed his hand. "This spring," he agreed. Together. The winter that followed was the strangest and sweetest of Colt's life. He and Jesse maintained their careful public distance, but everyone on the ranch seemed to understand that something had shifted. Dutch ran interference when needed, the other hands asked no questions, and slowly, imperceptibly, the walls between Colt and Jesse began to come down. They still met by the creek sometimes, but now those meetings felt less like stolen moments and more like promises. Each night they spent planning, talking about where they'd go and what they'd build. Jesse wanted horses, a breeding operation. Colt wanted open land and the freedom to live honestly. As winter faded and spring approached, Colt made his arrangements. He deeded the ranch to Dutch, who'd earned it 10 times over with his loyalty and discretion. He sold most of his cattle, keeping only enough to start a small herd elsewhere. And he bought supplies for the journey west, to the territories beyond Wyoming, where the law was still being written and men could disappear into new lives. The day they left, the entire ranch turned out to see them off. Colt sat his horse at the gate one final time, looking back at the land that had been his refuge and his prison for so many years. It should have hurt more, leaving. But with Jesse beside him and the open road ahead, all Colt felt was relief. Dutch rode up alongside them. "You take care of each other out." "There," he said gruffly, "and if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." "Thank you, Dutch." Colt extended his hand. "For everything." Dutch shook it firmly. "Just be happy, boss. That's all the thanks I need." Then they were riding out, just the two of them, heading west toward territories unmapped and futures unwritten. The morning sun warmed their backs as they left the only life Colt had known for a decade, but he didn't look back. His eyes were on the horizon and on Jesse riding beside him, finally, openly, together. They rode for weeks, through prairie and mountain passes, following rumors of new settlements and untamed land. Along the way, they met others like them, people who'd fled judgment and were building new communities where difference was accepted, even celebrated. Finally, in a green valley ringed by mountains, they found it. A piece of land with a creek running through it, grass for horses, and timber for building. It was wild and rough and perfect. "This is it," Jesse said, his eyes shining. "This is home." Colt looked at him, at the joy and hope written across his face, and felt something settle in his chest. Not the heaviness of loneliness or the weight of secrets, but the peaceful certainty of having found exactly where he belonged. "Yes," he agreed. "This is home." They built their cabin together over that summer, working side by side in the mountain air. No hiding, no pretending, just two men building a life. When other settlers passed through, they introduced each other honestly. "Jesse, my partner. Colt, the man I love." And if anyone had a problem with it, they quickly learned to keep it to themselves or move along. As autumn painted the mountains gold and red, they stood on the porch of their completed cabin, watching the sun set over their land. Jesse leaned against Colt's shoulder, and Colt wrapped an arm around him, holding him close. "No regrets?" Jesse asked softly. Colt thought about his old ranch, his years of loneliness, the life he'd left behind. Then he looked at Jesse, at their land, at the future stretching before them. "Not a single one," he said. "This, here with you, this is everything I never knew I was waiting for." Jesse turned in his arms and kissed him, sweet and slow and full of love. When they broke apart, both were smiling. "Welcome home," Jesse whispered. Colt pulled him closer, resting his chin on Jesse's head, and watched the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. He thought about the long journey that had brought them here, all the fear and risk and heartbreak. But looking at it now, knowing what waited at the end, he'd make every single choice again, because some things were worth the danger. Some things were worth everything. And Jesse Madsen, standing in his arms under a sky full of stars, was worth more than everything in the world. They'd found their place, carved out their own small corner of freedom in a world that would never fully accept them. But here, in their valley, with their horses and their home and each other, they were finally truly free. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.